There's a map you've probably never seen, created 2,500 years ago by someone we call the father of history, Herodotus. His map of the known world, drawn in 450 before Christ, contains something nobody talks about anymore. In northwest Africa, south of the Pillars of Hercules, he marked a word, a place name, Atlantes, not Atlantic Ocean, not a vague reference to a mythical island, a specific geographic location, on land, in Africa, precisely where modern satellites have photographed a structure that shouldn't exist. I'm not going to tell you this proves Atlantis was real. I'm going to show you why this correlation is strange enough that we should be asking questions nobody seems willing to ask. Questions about what Herodotus knew. Questions about what Plato was actually describing. Questions about a circular structure in the Sahara Desert that matches ancient specifications with uncomfortable precision. Let me start with what we actually know versus what we assume we know. Because the story of Atlantis has been told so many times that the mythology has replaced the original account. And the original account is stranger than the mythology. Plato, Athenian philosopher, wrote two dialogues around 360 before Christ called Timaeus and Critias. In these dialogues, he describes a place called Atlantis. Most people assume Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris and the fall of civilizations. A thought experiment, not a geography lesson. But read what Plato actually wrote. He doesn't present Atlantis as allegory. He presents it as historical account. He claims the information came from Solon, Athenian lawmaker who visited Egypt around 590 before Christ. According to Plato, Egyptian priests told Solon about Atlantis, ancient civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, destroyed by earthquakes and floods, disappeared in a single day and night. Plato provides details, specific details, the kind of details you give for a real place, not an imaginary one. Measurements, dimensions, geographic features, resources, climate, layout of the city, structure of the government. It reads like a geographic survey, not a fable. Now, was Plato telling the truth about his source? Did Solon actually visit Egypt and hear this story? Did Egyptian priests actually have records going back 9,000 years? We can't verify any of that. Plato is our only source. And Plato might have been doing exactly what people assume, inventing a story to make a philosophical point. Except there's something strange. 90 years before Plato wrote about Atlantis, Herodotus created his map. And on that map, in northwest Africa, he marked a place associated with Atlas and the Atlantes people. Not because he'd read Plato. Plato hadn't written about it yet. Because Herodotus, who traveled extensively and documented what he learned, believed there was a connection between that region and Atlas. Who was Atlas? According to Greek mythology, a titan, condemned to hold up the sky. But there's another Atlas in ancient sources. Atlas, king of Mauritania, legendary first king of the Mari people who inhabited northwest Africa, the region that's now Morocco, western Algeria, Mauritania. The Atlas Mountains are named after him. The Atlantic Ocean is named after those mountains. And according to ancient tradition, Atlas ruled from somewhere in that region. Herodotus marked that region on his map with the name Atlantes, people of Atlas. Is there a connection to Plato's Atlantis? We don't know, but the timing is interesting. Herodotus creates map marking Atlantes in northwest Africa. 90 years later, Plato describes Atlantis in a dialogue claiming the information came from Egyptian sources. Two independent references to Atlas-related places, both connected to northwest Africa or the region beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Could both be referencing the same tradition? Same historical memory? Same geographic location? Possible, but that's speculation. What's not speculation is that both sources exist. Both predate modern Atlantis mythology. Both point toward the same general region. Now, let me show you what satellites found. 1974. Landsat satellite photographs Northwest Africa, Mauritania, middle of the Sahara Desert. The images show something unexpected. A massive circular structure, concentric rings, visible from space, approximately 23 kilometers in diameter. Geologists call it the Richat Structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara. The official explanation is that it's a deeply eroded geologic dome, alternating layers of hard and soft rock. Differential erosion created the concentric rings, natural formation. Interesting, but not particularly mysterious, except when you start measuring it, when you start comparing it to ancient descriptions, when you start noticing details that don't quite fit the random erosion explanation. Plato said Atlantis was circular. Concentric rings, 3 rings of water, alternating with 2 rings of land. The Richat structure has concentric rings, 3 erosional channels that would have been waterways, 2 elevated ridges that would have been land. That's correspondence number 1. Configuration matches. Plato gave a specific size, 127 stades in diameter. A Greek stade was approximately 185 meters. Do the math. 127 times 185 equals 23,495 meters. 23.5 kilometers. Measure the Richat structure on Google Earth. Diameter of the outermost ring, 20 to 3.5 kilometers. Not approximately, exactly. That's correspondence number 2. Measurement matches. Plato described geographic features. Mountains to the north protecting from cold winds. Look at Richat on satellite view. The Adrar Plateau lies immediately to the north. Mountain range. Geographic barrier. Plato said fertile plains extended to the south. The Taoudenni Basin lies to the south of Richat. Now it's desert, but geological surveys show it was a lake basin and floodplain in the past, fertile when the climate was different. Plato said the city had access to the sea. Richat is 500 kilometers from the coast now. But 12,000 years ago, sea level was 120 meters lower. The coastline was different. And geological evidence shows the Sahara wasn't desert. It was savanna with rivers and lakes. The ancient coastline would have been closer. How much closer? We don't know exactly, but significantly closer than today. That's correspondence number 3. Geographic features match. Plato said freshwater springs existed in the city center. The center of the Richat structure has freshwater wells. The surrounding desert has saltwater wells. Why does the center have freshwater in the middle of a desert? Geologists explain it as aquifer characteristics. But it's notable that Plato specifically mentioned this detail, and it corresponds to reality. That's correspondence number 4. Hydrological detail matches. Plato described the stone used in construction. Black, red, and white stone. The Richat structure is composed of rocks with exactly those colors. Black basalt, red sandstone, white limestone, all present in the geologic layers. That's correspondence number 5. Materials match. Now, let me be very clear about what these correspondences mean and what they don't mean. They don't prove Richat is Atlantis. Correlation is not causation. But they do mean we should be asking questions, because this many specific correspondences, configuration, measurement, geography, hydrology, materials, that's beyond what we'd expect from random chance. If I told you there was a circular structure somewhere on Earth with 3 rings, you'd say that's mildly interesting, but not particularly rare. If I added that it's exactly 23.5 kilometers in diameter, you'd say that's more specific, but still possibly coincidental. If I added that it has mountains to the north and plains to the south, you'd start wondering. If I added that it has fresh water in the center surrounded by salt water, and it's made of black, red, and white stone, and it's located in a region where ancient maps marked Atlantes, at some point you stop calling it coincidence and start calling it correlation. That requires explanation. And here's where it gets stranger. Because we haven't talked about the timeline yet, or what happened to this region, or why a structure that matches an ancient description is now in the middle of a desert. Plato dated the destruction of Atlantis to 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. Solon visited around 590 before Christ. 9,000 years before, that puts us at approximately 9,600 before Christ. Let's round to 12,000 years ago to account for ancient calendar systems. What was happening 12,000 years ago? The end of the Younger Dryas period, a time of massive climate disruption. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a comet or asteroid impact around 12,800 years ago. The impact caused rapid melting of ice sheets. Sea level rose dramatically, approximately 120 meters over a relatively short period. Massive flooding, climate change. The event would have generated tsunamis, not just coastal flooding. Continental scale water movement. Northwest Africa would have been affected. The Atlantic coast would have been hit by tsunami waves. Water would have surged inland, following river valleys, filling lake basins. If a coastal city existed in that region, it would have been devastated. Not by sinking beneath the ocean, by being struck by the ocean and then buried in sediment as the water receded. And then the climate changed. The Sahara wasn't always desert. From approximately 15,000 to 5,000 years ago, the region experienced the African humid period. Monsoon rains, rivers, lakes, savanna vegetation, human habitation. The Sahara was green. We have evidence. Rock art showing cattle and wildlife. Archaeological sites, tool finds. People lived there, thrived there. Then, around 5,000 years ago, the climate shifted. The monsoons weakened. Rainfall decreased. Rivers dried up. Lakes evaporated. The region transitioned from savanna to desert over a period of centuries. Any cities that existed would have been abandoned as water resources disappeared. Any structures would have been buried by wind-blown sand. The desert consumed everything. But structures don't disappear. They get buried, and sometimes erosion reveals them again. The Richat structure is deeply eroded. The concentric rings are erosional features carved by water and wind over thousands of years. If there was ever a city built on that structure, the buildings would be long gone, but the foundation might remain. The underlying rock layers, the pattern, the blueprint. We can't know if Richat was Atlantis without excavation, without systematic archaeological survey, without ground-penetrating radar, without dating any artifacts that might be buried there. None of that has been done. The Richat structure has been studied geologically, but not archaeologically, not with the assumption that it might be a human site rather than just a natural formation. Why not? Because academics dismiss the Atlantis connection as pseudoscience. Because investigating Richat as a potential archaeological site would associate researchers with fringe theories. Because institutional credibility is more important than following evidence. Because the assumption is that Atlantis was mythology, so there's no point looking for it. But that assumption might be wrong. What if Plato wasn't writing fiction? What if he was recording a garbled historical memory that Egyptian priests preserved? What if Herodotus marked Atlantes on his map because he'd heard the same traditions? What if Richat is where those traditions originated? We can't answer those questions without investigation. An investigation isn't happening because of institutional bias against the idea. That's not science. That's paradigm protection. Science would say, Here's a structure that matches ancient descriptions. Let's examine it properly and determine whether there's any archaeological evidence. Paradigm protection says, the idea is fringe, so we won't look because looking would validate the fringe. That's backwards. We should look precisely because the correspondences are strange. Because the correlations are specific enough to warrant investigation. Because dismissing without examination is the opposite of scientific inquiry. Let me address the obvious objection. Richat is 400 meters above sea level. How could it have been a coastal city? If the coast was closer 12,000 years ago, it still wasn't that much closer. The structure is inland, not on the coast, except there's geological evidence that the Richat structure has been uplifted, vertically displaced. The structure shows signs of tectonic activity. The concentric rings are thought to be related to a dome structure, magma intrusion that pushed rock layers upward. And some geologists have suggested the structure has been through multiple episodes of uplift and subsidence. What if Richat was near sea level 12,000 years ago? What if it was a coastal or near coastal site? What if it was uplifted after the climate changed, after the region became desert? That would explain why it's now at elevation. It would explain why it's preserved, being lifted above sea level, protected it from continued water erosion. It would explain the current topography. Is that what happened? We don't know. But it's geologically plausible. The region shows tectonic activity. The structure shows evidence of uplift. The timeline works. Coastal site 12,000 years ago. Destroyed by flooding. Climate changes to desert. Site is uplifted and preserved as erosion removes softer sediment. Eventually revealed as a circular structure visible from space. That's a hypothesis, not proof, but a testable hypothesis. We could test it by dating rock layers, by looking for uplift markers, by conducting archaeological surveys, by using ground-penetrating radar to see if there are any structured remains beneath the sand. None of that has been done. So we're left with correspondences and questions. And the question that bothers me most is this: why isn't anyone looking? If I'm wrong, if there's no archaeological evidence at Richat, then investigating would prove that quickly. Spend a few months with proper equipment. Survey the site. Use remote sensing. Excavate targeted areas. If there's nothing there, we'd know. The Atlantis-Richat connection would be definitively disproven. But if I'm right, if there is evidence of ancient human habitation at a scale that matches Plato's description, then we found something historically significant. Not just Atlantis, that's just a name, but evidence of sophisticated civilization 12,000 years ago, before agriculture supposedly began, before cities supposedly existed. That would rewrite chronology. That would change our understanding of human development. So why wouldn't we look? Either we disprove a persistent fringe theory, or we make a major discovery. Either outcome advances knowledge, but instead, the site sits unexamined, because examining it would associate researchers with Atlantis hunters. That's not reason, that's fear of reputation damage. And meanwhile, the correspondences remain. Herodotus's map remains. The measurements remain. The geographic matches remain. The timeline remains. The geological evidence of regional flooding and climate change remains. All of it documented. All of it verifiable. All of it pointing to the same location. I'm not saying Richat is definitely Atlantis. I'm saying the correlation is strange enough that scientific investigation is warranted. I'm saying we should follow the evidence rather than dismiss it because of preconceptions about what Atlantis is or isn't. I'm saying that if ancient sources describe a place with specific characteristics, and we find a place with those exact characteristics, we should examine it properly instead of assuming it must be coincidence. Maybe it is coincidence. Maybe Plato invented Atlantis and by pure chance described something that happens to exist. Maybe Herodotus marked Atlantes on his map for reasons unrelated to Atlantis. Maybe all the correspondences are meaningless. Maybe there's nothing at Richat except eroded rock. But maybe not. Maybe Plato was recording actual geography. Maybe Herodotus knew something. Maybe the correspondences mean what they appear to mean. Maybe there's evidence buried under Saharan sand, waiting for someone to look. We won't know until we look. And looking requires overcoming institutional resistance to examining anything associated with Atlantis. That's the real obstacle. Not lack of technology, not difficulty of access, not impossibility of the hypothesis, just unwillingness to risk reputation by investigating something labeled fringe. But fringe theories sometimes turn out to be true. Göbekli Tepe was dismissed as impossible until it was excavated. Troy was considered mythology until Schliemann found it. Continental drift was ridiculed until plate tectonics proved it. Science advances by examining claims, not by dismissing them unexamined. Richat deserves examination. The correspondences are too specific. The ancient sources are too consistent. The geographic match is too precise, and the potential significance is too great to ignore. I don't know if Atlantis was real. I don't know if Richat is Atlantis, but I know the question is worth asking. The correlation is worth investigating. The evidence is worth examining, and dismissing it without investigation is not science. So here's what I'm suggesting. Not that Richat is definitely Atlantis, that we should look, that we should apply the same archaeological standards to Richat that we'd apply to any other site that showed potential signs of ancient habitation. Survey it, study it, test it, and let the evidence determine conclusions rather than letting preconceptions prevent investigation. Maybe we find nothing. Maybe the correspondences are coincidence. Maybe Atlantis really was just Plato's invention. If so, investigation would prove that. But maybe we find something. Maybe there are structural remains beneath the sand. Maybe there are artifacts indicating human habitation at the right time period. Maybe the geological evidence supports the uplift hypothesis. Maybe the correlations mean something. We won't know until we look, and we should look. Because the only thing worse than investigating and finding nothing would be not investigating and never knowing. The correspondences are there. The ancient sources exist. The structure exists. The question exists. What's needed is the willingness to ask it properly, without preconception, without fear of association with fringe theories, with genuine scientific curiosity about why ancient sources describe something that appears to exist. That's what this is really about. Not proving Atlantis was real. Asking whether the correlation between ancient descriptions and modern satellite data is meaningful. Whether it indicates something worth investigating. Whether dismissal without examination is justified. I think the correlation is strange enough to warrant investigation. Strange enough that ignoring it is intellectually dishonest. Strange enough that we should be asking questions rather than assuming answers. Herodotus marked Atlantes on a map. Plato described Atlantis with specific details. Satellites found a structure matching those details in the region Herodotus marked. That's not proof, but it's not nothing either. It's a question, a geographic question, a historical question, an archaeological question, and questions deserve investigation, not dismissal. So I'm not telling you Atlantis was real. I'm asking, shouldn't we check? Shouldn't we examine the one place on Earth that matches ancient descriptions? Shouldn't we investigate the correlation rather than assuming it away? The structure is there. The maps are there. The descriptions are there. The timeline fits. The geology supports it. The only thing missing is willingness to look. And that's the mystery I can't solve. Not whether Atlantis existed, but why? Nobody wants to find out.